The Pacific Invitational Karate Tournament ran for 3 days every September at the Long Beach Arena, and the 1971 edition had drawn more serious practitioners than any previous year. 4,000 of them filled the seats for the final day's program. Not fans exactly, at least not in the way people use that word for sporting events. These were practitioners, coaches, former competitors, students of the discipline, who understood what they were watching in the specific way that only people who had done the thing themselves could understand it. The energy in the building was the energy of people who had been watching high-level competition for 2 days and had arrived at the third day sharpened and ready. Chuck Norris was the tournament's headline demonstrator. He had retired from competition the previous year, undefeated as a 7-time world champion, and had moved into demonstration and instruction. His presence at events like this one carried a specific weight that was not about celebrity in the entertainment sense. It was about record. About what he had actually done on mats, like the ones laid out on the arena floor below. 4,000 practitioners in the seats knew his record the way musicians know who has won which award, with the specific reverence of people who understand what the achievement cost. He had been demonstrating for 45 minutes. The demonstration was genuine. He moved with the economy of someone who had spent 20 years removing everything unnecessary from his technique, and what remained was clean and precise, and illuminating in the way that genuine mastery is illuminating, showing the audience the principle underneath the technique rather than just the technique itself. Bruce Lee was in the front row. He had not been announced. He had a ticket, same as anyone else, purchased through a contact who knew someone on the organizing committee. He had been sitting in his seat since the doors opened, watching the full program with the quality of attention he brought to anything serious, which was total and patient, and building a picture from what he observed. He had been watching Chuck, specifically with the focused interest of one serious practitioner watching another, noting what the techniques revealed about the principles, finding the places where the system and his own overlapped and where they diverged. He had not planned to do anything except watch. The day had other plans. Subscribe right now, because what happens in the next 20 minutes changes the atmosphere of the entire building, from celebration to something nobody came here expecting. Dolph Lundgren was 20 years old and had been in the United States for 18 months. He was Swedish, born in Stockholm, and had been training in martial arts since he was 11, karate first, then Kyokushin, then boxing, and in the months before he arrived in America, a period of serious sambo training in Europe that had added a wrestling component to what was already a genuinely frightening physical package. He was 6'5" and 240 pounds at 20 years old. He was still growing in the specific way that some young men continue to develop into their mid-20s, adding mass and condition to a frame that was already exceptional. His physical gifts were real and obvious, and he had spent 9 years building seriously on top of them. He also had a quality that some genuinely talented young athletes developed when their talent had never found its ceiling, which was a specific brand of certainty about himself that occasionally crossed into territory that more experienced people in the room recognized as the certainty of someone who had not yet met the thing that would correct it. He had come to the tournament on the recommendation of his American trainer, a legitimate Kyokushin coach named Ray, who had brought him specifically to watch the demonstration level, to see what serious American tournament karate looked like at the top of its development. Ray had not fully accounted for what would happen when Dolph watched Chuck Norris move. The problem was not that Dolph was unimpressed. The problem was that he was watching Chuck's demonstration with a different kind of attention from the rest of the audience. Where 4,000 practitioners were watching mastery and recognizing it as such, Dolph was watching and doing what young men with exceptional physical gifts sometimes do, which was comparing, running calculations, finding the places where he thought he saw gaps. He was not entirely wrong about what he saw. He was entirely wrong about what it meant. Ray noticed Dolph's expression during the demonstration and felt the specific premonitory unease of someone who has worked with talented young athletes long enough to recognize the expression that precedes a bad decision. He leaned over and said, quietly, "Don't." Dolph said, "I haven't said anything." Ray said, "I know what that face means." Dolph said nothing, which was not reassurance. The demonstration concluded. The audience gave Chuck the response he had earned, sustained and genuine, the applause of people who had watched something real and were expressing that. Chuck took questions from the floor, the way he sometimes did at events like this, because he genuinely enjoyed the conversation that happened between serious practitioners. He answered 2 questions about tournament strategy and 1 about breathing. The exchange was warm and substantive. Then Dolph stood up. He did it from 4 rows behind the front row. He stood to his full height, which made him immediately visible above everyone seated around him, and he said, in English that carried his Swedish accent. "Can I ask something?" Chuck looked at him. He registered the size first, because everyone registered the size first with Dolph, and then the youth of the face, and then the specific quality of the way he was standing, which was not the way someone stands when they want to ask a respectful question. Chuck said, "Go ahead." Dolph said, "I watched your whole demonstration. I have a lot of respect for what you've built. I can see the technique is real." Chuck said, "Thank you." Dolph said, "But I want to ask something honestly. The techniques you showed, they work against the opponents you've competed against, people who are working within the same framework as you. How do they work against something that comes from a completely different direction?" Chuck said, "Every serious technique transfers. The principles are universal." Dolph said, "That's the theory." Chuck said, "It's also the practice." Dolph said, "I'd like to test that." The building went quieter. Chuck said, "What do you mean by test?" Dolph said, "I mean I'd like to step onto the floor and see whether what you've demonstrated works when someone's actually trying." The building went quieter still. 4,000 practitioners processing what had just been said and what it implied about the person who said it. Chuck looked at him. He was very good at reading rooms and people. He was reading this young man and finding several things. Genuine physical capability, that was visible. Genuine confidence, also visible, and the specific miscalibration that came from capability meeting confidence before the two had been properly tested against each other. He said, "That's not what this event is designed for." Dolph said, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm asking whether the demonstration is demonstration or reality." Chuck said, "I've answered that question across 7 world championships." Dolph said, "Against people inside your system." Chuck said, "Against the best karate competitors in the world." Dolph said, "Yes, karate competitors." He let this land for a moment. "I'm not a karate competitor." Chuck looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I know what you are. I can see it from here." Dolph said, "Then you know I'm serious." Chuck said, "I know you're young." Dolph said, "That's not an answer." 4,000 people were very still. The organizing committee members at the floor's edge were looking at each other with the expressions of people who need to decide whether to intervene and have not yet decided. Chuck said, "I'm not going to step onto the floor with a 20-year-old who's trying to make a name for himself at my expense." Dolph said, "That's one way to look at it." Chuck said, "What's another?" Dolph said, "That you're not stepping onto the floor." The building made the sound that buildings make when 4,000 people simultaneously understand that something has moved past a point. Chuck's expression did not change significantly. He had been a competitive fighter for 20 years. He had been in rooms where people said things designed to make him react badly, and he had learned a long time ago that the reaction they were looking for was itself the loss. He said, "I've answered your question. I'm going to move on." He turned back toward the floor to indicate the exchange was concluded. Dolph stepped out of his row and walked toward the floor. Ray said his name, sharply. Dolph did not stop. He walked to the floor's edge and stepped onto it. The organizing committee members moved toward him. 2 of them, practiced and professional, stepping into his path with the body language of people who were going to physically redirect this if they needed to. Dolph said, politely, "I'm not going to hurt anyone. I just want to ask something directly." The committee members looked at Chuck. Chuck looked at Dolph on the floor. He looked at 4,000 people in the seats. He made the decision that a man made when someone had backed him into a corner in front of an audience, and the choices available were all imperfect. He stepped onto the floor. Like this video right now. Because what happens in the next 60 seconds is something that nobody who was in that building has ever described the same way twice. They stood on the tournament floor 10 feet apart. Chuck was 5'10" and 170 pounds. Dolph was 6'5" and 240 pounds. The visual difference was significant, and the 4,000 people watching were all doing the visual arithmetic and arriving at the same conclusions about what physical physics suggested about what they were about to watch. Chuck said, "I'm going to say this once. I came here to demonstrate and discuss, not to compete." Dolph said, "I hear you." Chuck said, "You're trying to make a point about real versus demonstration." Dolph said, "Yes." Chuck said, "I've already made that point." "Across 20 years." Dolph said, "Let me see it." Chuck said, "One exchange, light contact. The committee stops it when they say so." Dolph said, "Fine." They took their positions. Chuck in his karate stance, clean and settled, the stance of 20 years of daily practice. Dolph in a hybrid that showed the multiple disciplines in his training, lower than a pure karate stance, slightly wider, the stance of someone who had been influenced by wrestling and boxing and Kyokushin simultaneously. The committee chair said go. Dolph moved immediately. He did not ease into it the way tournament competitors often eased into first exchanges. He came with full commitment, a straight punch with his right hand that carried his weight and his reach, and was moving at a speed that most people in the building found genuinely alarming. Chuck slipped it. Clean, minimal, the head moving offline by exactly the amount required. His right hand came forward and found Dolph's extended arm at the forearm, redirecting the punch's momentum sideways, and his left hand touched Dolph's shoulder. 1 exchange. 1 point. The audience responded. Dolph reset. He had not expected the slip. He had expected the punch to land or to be blocked with force. The slip had worked differently from either of those outcomes, and he was incorporating the information. He came again, this time lower, trying to change the geometry, reaching for the closer range engagement where his size advantages became more decisive. Chuck moved inside the reach rather than away from it, stepping to the outside of Dolph's extended arm, and from that outside position his right hand found Dolph's ribs. Light contact, controlled. The specific contact of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing exactly as much of it as the situation requires. The audience responded again. Dolph straightened. He looked at Chuck with an expression that contained genuine reassessment rather than anger. He said, "All right." He said it with the quality of someone meaning it, acknowledging information received. Then, something changed in his face. It changed the way things change in the faces of young men who have accumulated 9 years of training and 240 pounds of capability and have found, for the first time, something that they cannot immediately solve through the tools available to them, and whose pride processes that finding faster than their judgment does. He came forward, not with the controlled, committed technique of the previous 2 exchanges. He came with the full force of everything he had, arms grabbing for control, trying to use his size to establish the close-range engagement where his wrestling training would give him options he didn't have at distance. Chuck's hands came up to redirect the grab. He got both hands on Dolph's right arm and turned to use the momentum. But 240 pounds of committed 20-year-old moving at full speed was not a problem that redirecting one arm solved cleanly. Dolph's left arm came around and found Chuck's shoulder, and his weight continued forward, and both men went sideways together. Chuck caught himself. Dolph's grip had found him. Dolph pressed the grip. His wrestling training was there. Immediately, the body doing what it had been trained to do, and he was trying to use the position to take Chuck to the mat. Chuck was resisting. He was experienced and serious, and he was not going to the mat easily. The committee chair was shouting for them to stop. The committee members were moving onto the floor. 4,000 people were on their feet. And in the front row, the man who had been sitting quietly for several hours, watching a tournament, reached a decision. Bruce Lee stood up. He did not move dramatically. He stood the way he always stood, from a still position to an upright one, in a motion that produced no sound and no visual drama. He stepped over the floor barrier without hurrying. He walked toward the 2 men who were still grappling in the center of the floor with the specific pace of someone who has calculated exactly how much time is available and is using it precisely. He said, "Enough." He said it at a volume that should not have carried over the noise of 4,000 people on their feet and a committee chair shouting, and 2 large men grappling on a tournament floor. It carried. Dolph heard it first. His head turned. His grip loosened by a fraction. Chuck heard it, a half-second later. He found the fraction of release in Dolph's grip and used it to separate. Both of them were looking at the man who had just walked onto the floor. The building had gone from its considerable noise to something considerably quieter. Not silence. The specific, almost silence of 4,000 people who have just recognized something and are processing the recognition. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the Long Beach Arena tournament floor in plain dark clothes, 5'7" and 140 pounds, and the building reorganized itself around his presence in the specific way it always did, a thing that could not be manufactured and that the people who witnessed it consistently struggled to describe accurately afterward. Dolph looked at him. He said, "Who are you?" Chuck said, before Bruce could answer. "You should know the answer to that." Dolph looked at Chuck. He looked at Bruce. Something was happening in his face as the information resolved. He said, "Bruce Lee." Bruce said, "Yes." Dolph said, "You were watching." Bruce said, "I've been watching since the doors opened." Dolph looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Bruce, with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the situation they were in had more witnesses than they accounted for. He said, "And?" Bruce said, "You have genuine capability. You're also doing something that your capability doesn't require." Dolph said, "What?" Bruce said, "Proving it to people who didn't ask." The building was completely quiet. Dolph looked at him. He looked at Chuck. He looked at the 4,000 people in the seats. He said, Chuck is the most decorated tournament fighter in this country. I wanted to know if it was real. Bruce said, you found out it was real in the first 2 exchanges, then you kept going. Dolph said, Bruce said, because finding out it was real was harder to accept than you expected. Dolph was quiet. Bruce said, there's no shame in that, it's information. What you do with it is what matters. He turned to Chuck. He said, are you all right? Chuck said, yes. Bruce said, good. He looked at both of them. He said, you're both serious. You've both built something real. He said, that's not a small thing. Most people never build anything real. He said, don't waste it on this. Dolph said, I came here to learn. Bruce said, then learn the right lesson from what just happened. Dolph said, which is? Bruce said, that the person who walks onto a floor to prove something has already lost the most important exchange. Dolph looked at him. Bruce said, the exchange inside yourself. The one that started when you decided the demonstration was a challenge rather than a gift. The building was still very quiet. Dolph said, that's a generous way to look at it. Bruce said, it's an accurate one. Chuck spent 45 minutes showing 4,000 people what 20 years of serious work looks like. You spent 45 minutes deciding whether it was good enough. He said, who was learning and who was judging? Dolph had nothing to say to that. Chuck looked at Bruce. He said, I didn't see you come in. Bruce said, I had a seat in the front row. Chuck said, since when? Bruce said, since the morning session. I wanted to watch the full program. Chuck said, you came to watch. Bruce said, I came to watch. Then something required addressing. The committee chair had reached them. He was saying something about the tournament rules and the floor protocols and the need to restore the program. He said it with the specific professional calm of someone managing something that had moved past the scope of what he planned for. Bruce looked at him. He said, I apologize for coming onto the floor without authorization. The committee chair looked at him. He said slowly, you're Bruce Lee. Bruce said, yes. The committee chair looked at the tournament floor, the tournament program, the 4,000 people in the seats. He said, I think the program can accommodate a brief interruption. The audience, which had been very quiet, responded to this with the warmth of people who have been through something and have arrived at a resolution and are glad for it. The 3 of them stood on the floor for several minutes, not performing for the audience, just present in the space together. Dolph said, can I ask you something? Bruce said, yes. Dolph said, how do you read someone that fast? What you said to me, that I found it harder to accept than I expected. How did you see that from the front row? Bruce said, your expression changed after the first exchange. Before the first exchange, you had a specific quality of certainty. After it, the certainty was still there, but it had a different texture. It was working harder. Dolph said, and that told you. Bruce said, that the information you received was causing you a problem. People who can accept information easily don't show that texture. People who are fighting the information do. Dolph said, you watched my face. Bruce said, I watched everything. The face, the stance, the breathing, all of it told the same story. Dolph said, and what story was that? Bruce said, someone with real capability who came here to find out something and found out something he didn't want to find out. Dolph said, that he wasn't the best. Bruce said, that experience has a quality that youth and capability can't replicate. Not because experience is magical. Because experience is the accumulation of encounters with things that didn't go as planned and the adjustments that followed. He said, Chuck has 20 years of those adjustments. They're in every movement he makes. You can see them if you know what to look for. Dolph said, and you can see them. Bruce said, yes. Dolph said, teach me to see them. Bruce looked at him for a moment. He said, you just started. Dolph said, what do you mean? Bruce said, the moment you stop trying to prove something and start trying to learn something, you've started learning to see. You've been in both states in the last hour. Right now, you're in the second one. Chuck, who had been listening with the specific attention of someone who recognized a conversation worth listening to, said, he's right. Dolph looked at him. Chuck said, I was in the same state you were at your age. It took me longer to move out of it than it should have. Dolph said, what moved you out of it? Chuck said, losing, specifically. Dolph said, I haven't lost. Chuck said, yet. He said it without any unkindness, just as a fact about how training worked at the level they were discussing. Dolph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, tonight, you showed me something that should count as a loss. Chuck said, does it? Dolph said, I came here thinking I could walk onto a tournament floor and challenge the best fighter in the building. he said, "and I ended up in the middle of the floor with both of you watching me figure out I was wrong about several things." Bruce said, "That's not a loss." Dolph said, "It feels like one." Bruce said, "It feels like information. Losses feel like damage. Information feels like exactly this, something you want to argue with but can't." Dolph looked at him. He said, "How do you know the difference?" Bruce said, "Because you're still on your feet and still asking questions. A loss ends the conversation. Information starts it." The committee chair gave the three of them 15 minutes on the floor with an open microphone. It was not a planned part of the program. The tournament audience had just watched something that the program had not accounted for, and the committee chair understood that what they had just seen deserved acknowledgement before the program moved on. He said as much, into his own microphone, and the audience responded to his acknowledgement with the warm response of people who have been through something together. Bruce spoke briefly. He said that he had come as an audience member and remained an audience member. He said the tournament program represented serious work by serious people. He said the interruption to the program had also represented something serious, which was a young practitioner trying to understand where the ceiling was, which was a legitimate thing to want to know. He said he hoped the afternoon had been instructive in the way that afternoons were instructive when more happened in them than was planned. The audience applauded. Chuck spoke briefly. He said that what Bruce had said was more generous than he had earned, and that what the afternoon had shown him, watching a young man with genuine physical gifts step onto a floor and then stop stepping once he understood what he was stepping into, was something he had needed to see at that age, and had not. He looked at Dolph when he said this last part. Dolph spoke last. He said his name, his age, where he was from. He said he had come to the tournament to watch serious karate, and had ended up on the floor being corrected by two people with more information than he had about what serious looked like. He said he was grateful for the correction, even though it had not felt like gratitude when it was happening. He said he intended to be back at the next tournament, in the audience, watching the full program, and that he would bring better questions than the one he had brought today. The audience applauded this, longer than they applauded anything else. Afterward, in the corridor outside the main floor, the three of them stood together for a few minutes, while the tournament program resumed behind them. The sound of the audience filtered through the walls. Dolph asked Bruce about the adjustment from the first exchange, how Chuck had slipped the punch rather than blocking it. Bruce walked him through the mechanics, not as instruction exactly, more as description, the way you describe something you have spent a long time understanding. He talked about the difference between meeting force and redirecting it, and what each approach cost in terms of energy and position. Dolph listened with a quality of attention that was different from the quality he had brought onto the floor earlier. The earlier quality had been evaluating. This quality was receiving. Chuck watched this and said nothing. He did not need to add anything. He had seen this exact shift happen in practitioners before, the shift from comparison to reception, and he knew that the best thing to do when it happened was to stay out of the way of it. Dolph said, "How long does it take to develop that? The ability to read what's coming before it arrives." Bruce said, "Years of specific practice, but you start getting useful versions of it much earlier, if you're working on it deliberately." Dolph said, "What do I practice?" Bruce said, "The moment before the technique. Not the technique itself. The body announces what it's going to do before it does it. Everybody. Yours too." Dolph said, "What does mine announce?" Bruce said, "Your right shoulder comes slightly forward before any right hand technique. It's a small movement, about a quarter second before your hand moves." Dolph worked his right shoulder slowly, checking the description against his own body's memory of what it did. He said, "I didn't know I was doing that." Bruce said, "You've been doing it for 9 years. It's built that deep." Dolph said, "Can I change it?" Bruce said, "You can make it smaller. It will take months of deliberate attention at the initiation rather than the technique." Dolph said, "And while I'm working on it." Bruce said, "Your technique is worse before it's better. The correction costs before it pays." Dolph said, "That's honest." Bruce said, "You asked an honest question." They stood in the corridor for a while longer. The tournament noise filtered through the walls. The program had resumed, and something was happening on the floor that the audience was responding to. Eventually, Chuck said he needed to get back to the floor for the closing portion of the program. Bruce said he would stay for it. He had a seat in the front row. Chuck looked at him for a moment. He said, "You've been here since the morning." Bruce said, "It was worth the full day." Chuck said, "Even with the interruption." Bruce said, "Especially with the interruption." Dolph walked back to the tournament with them. He found his seat in the fourth row. He watched the rest of the afternoon's program with a different quality of attention from the one he had brought in the morning. It was the attention of someone who was watching, rather than evaluating. The attention of someone who had received enough information in one afternoon to keep him working for several years, and who understood, for the first time, that this was what a serious afternoon felt like. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Tell me in the comments what you think Dolph was thinking in the moment when he recognized Bruce Lee's name. I read every one.